So just want to welcome everybody to the virtual day of the 2026 NC Live Annual Conference. We're really excited to have you join us online. And the session you're in right now is The Thing About Congressional Collections, a case study it's a case study of the Richard Burr papers. So if you're looking for a different virtual session, you can find the Zoom links on Sched, and Devin's going to put that in the chat. My name is Jen Brozick. I'm the moderator for this session. Just want to share a few things before we begin. So, as you heard this morning at NC Live events, we value the presence and active participation of all attendees. So, by joining us, you agree to uphold the principles of our code of conduct, which can be found on our website. And then again, you'll see a link in the chat about this if you'd like to read it. In the interest in time, we're going to save Q&A for the end of the session. If you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box or the chat we'll be monitoring. You can find that in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring the Q&A, like I said, and chat in case anyone needs assistance as well. So please make sure you stay muted during the presentation. The session is being recorded, and the presenter slides will be posted after the conference if you'd like to access them later. So now I'm pleased to introduce Stephanie Bennett and Kate Trathen. Stephanie Bennett is the director of the Center of Southeast North Carolina Archives and History at UNC Wilmington. Stephanie formerly served as a collection archivist at Wake Forest University. And Kate Trathen is a processing archivist at ZSR, Library Special Collection and Archives at Wake Forest University. Kate formerly served as the visiting librarian for the Burr Congressional collection at the ZSR Library Special Collections and Archives. So we'll hand it off to you guys.
Thanks so much, Jen. Welcome to our talk, as everyone has said, about making the collection of Senator Richard Burr available for research. This picture is the back of Richard Burr's VW Thing, which he was known to drive around Capitol Hill. Thankfully, the car was not included in the collection donation, but we have sort of made it a thing in our presentation, because who doesn't love a road trip? And here is where our map will take us today. First, how and why did Wake come to acquire his papers? What exactly were we getting into, and what ended up being the things that came to us? How did we get a term archivist when we all know how hard getting positions can be? How did our newly hired archivist, Kate, go about processing the materials? How it started, how it went, roadblocks, lessons learned, all the fun things, and where Kate and the collection are now after about 3 years. They've had an arduous journey, and we're going to talk about it. I presume, since this is a North Carolina conference, that most people know who Richard Burr is, that hear some specifics about him, especially related to the collection and how he came to be in our custody. His materials came to be in our custody. He is most known for serving North Carolina. He first spent 10 years in the House representing the 5th District. That, of course, has shifted over time, but when he was in that position, it covered most of the northwest corner of the state, from Boone up to the Virginia line and over to parts of Forsyth and Guilford counties. In 2004, he was elected to represent North Carolina in the Senate for the first time, winning John Edwards' seat. Burr spent 3 terms in the Senate, 18 years, and his most prominent position was as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Closer to home, Burr was born in Virginia, but moved to Winston-Salem as a child. He graduated from high school in Winston and then stayed in town to attend Wake Forest. At Wake, he majored in communications, played football, and was a member of the Kappa Sigma fraternity. And all of these parts of his background are represented in the collection to some degree. So how did his collection come to be in Special Collections and Archives care? Well, it probably will not surprise you that a collection of this prestige did not come in the way that our average collection donation does. As the collection's archivist at the time, I didn't hear much about it in advance of this agreement pictured here being signed in 2018, nor was I invited to the party. That's okay. We did get the pen pictured here that he signed the agreement with as an early accession, so it's almost like I was there. And anyone who looks at the collection can pretend they were there also. When the dean of the library learned about the donation, which was prior to this signing, it benefited Special Collections and Archives greatly that he was firm about us needing a project archivist to make the collection available, and made it clear that we would not start any work on it until that position was filled. I was the sole archivist processing manuscript collections at that time and could not focus on this collection given all the other responsibilities under my purview. So having him sort of be firm about that was very helpful. The special collections director made that as clear as possible, but it wouldn't have been possible without his support and communication of that, given that the stakeholders included the provost, the university president, board of trustees, things like that. So on to what exactly did it mean that we accepted this collection? Uh, what what was a 30-year political career going to look like in boxes? I had processed congressional and government collections through 1970s era, but had no experience with a more modern material. What was processing a congressional collection from the turn of the millennium going to involve? How large would the digital footprint be? I did not even think to worry about the memorabilia, and I should have. We had no clue what was coming. The papers were definitely just like, we started picking them up. So we did get a small amount of materials, like I said, from the signature event. The first office pickup, and all of those took place in Winston-Salem from that office, began in 2019. We, of course, took a break from pickups and materials during the height of the pandemic. And during that time, funding for a processing position came through the president's office in 2022. In retrospect, it was extremely helpful to have someone working on the collection as Burr was literally vacating his office and sending that big donation down in January 2023. Had there been a lag between his retirement and the processing, it's likely that we wouldn't have discovered any collection gaps until it was too late to reach out and ask about them or even understand what we were looking at. Ooh. Because the collection sort of dripped in, oh boy. What did we even have? I did not know, as the collections archivist in charge of collections before we hired Kate, what exactly we had brought in from his offices. It was mostly these white boxes, government issue, a lot of numbers that did not necessarily make sense, especially upon first glance. We knew that early on the collection donations had inventories, but weren't sure if all of them had inventories. Maybe there was some information in the boxes. We did not open them to look and see what was inside. We were just picking up the boxes from his office, taking them to the offsite storage facility that the library uses, setting aside any related paperwork, putting it in a PDF and putting it on someone's computer and ignoring the collection as the dean had said we could. I would characterize my knowledge of the collection prior to trying to get things ready for Kate to be 50%, and that is probably overestimating my sense of what we had. So you need a buddy for a road trip, especially one this big. So I went about hiring the project archivist. When the collection had first been discussed in 2018, there was conversation about a named research center to go along with the collection, a lot more complexity. It was unsure to me at that time what the collection, like what the archives role would be, or what my role would be for that matter, in regards to like a legislative center. I was happy that we were able to get the archivist and process the collection. And, if any of that comes to fruition, the collection's done now. And we were able to get from the president's office a guarantee of 2 years salary and benefits for a visiting faculty archivist with the possibility of an extension for a third year. So that gave us a little bit of wiggle room. And if there was interest in an exhibit or more outreach related to the collection, we were hopeful that that third year would help us out. So now we have the funding. I get to hire. Even though that ground was well traveled by others, it was all new to me. My first time leading a search committee. It was a post-pandemic search committee, so searches have become more flexible, but I had more options, which sometimes could be confusing or overwhelming. Also, because at that time searches were normally chaired by department heads at Wake, the process wasn't necessarily clearly documented, or at least from my standpoint, I wasn't always sure what I was supposed to be doing, what the order of operations was, or what candidates were seeing on their end. I have more of a knowledge now that that's unfortunately a common experience in hiring, but at the time I was like, what am I doing? Um, what came in handy was my experience working with undergraduate student workers and a few graduate student interns. Obviously, a visiting faculty member would be at a different level, but I just kind of figured I knew enough about what I was doing and could scale up my practices for an experienced new professional. I was aiming to hire someone who shared a sense of DAX compliant finding aids, which is an archival finding aid standard, and would be ready to corral the large collection and take it apart in order to process it. We had a number of great candidates, many with practical collections experience, which I felt was a must for a collection of this size. As an unexpected benefit, Kate also had experience with government records and specifically born digital materials. Again, at the point of hire, we did not have any digital records in hand. We did not know if we would ever get digital records, but it seemed like something that could come in handy, and in fact, it did. Um, and now let me turn it on over to Kate.
Hello. So we have reached the point of this journey where I have arrived at ZSR. But before I could fully dive into processing the Burr papers, I had to onboard to my new job. As with starting any new job, I had to adjust to a new workplace, colleagues, and responsibilities. I was coming from a state government environment to a university academic library environment, which was a significant shift for me. And so I sort of needed to acclimate to this different work culture. Additionally, this was by far the largest and most complex collection I had ever worked on to this point in my career. Um, and as a former digital archivist, I was a little bit rusty when it came to physical processing. I find myself looking at a mountain of boxes, as you saw in the photo, and struggling how to figure out how I would actually start this project. Next slide, please. Luckily, I did have some help navigating this on-ramp. I was assigned a mentor from a different department in ZSR to help orient me to the library in general, and resources available to me within the library. I was also aided by Stephanie and other colleagues in special collections and archives, who helped me to acclimate to the day-to-day tasks of my work and working on the team. I also had to orient myself to congressional collections, which are larger and more complex than anything else I'd ever worked on. One great resource I want to specifically talk about is this book, Managing Congressional Collections by Cynthia Peace Miller. This was great in explaining some of the jargon that you might find around congressional collections, and sort of just demystifying the different types of records that will find in them. There are also two great professional organizations to look into. There's the Congressional Papers section of the Society of American Archivists, and then there is the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. And so these two organizations, they're small but mighty. They're focused on this niche topic of congressional archives, and they offer many trainings, webinars, and annual meetings to take advantage of. Next slide. So how did I start to do the thing, also known as processing this collection? Before I actually started, I needed to make a processing plan. So to do this, I had the pleasure of opening every box in the collection, which had not been done. And I made a basic box inventory. This helped me to understand what was in the collection at a very high level. Once I was sort of wrapped my mind around that, I was able to use the inventory to intellectually organize the collection into series. These series formed the basis of my processing plan. In the processing plan, I laid out the series I planned to use, the processing steps I would take for each series, and a rough timeline to finish the entire project. Once I had my plan in place, I just had to find a good place to start, which is harder than you might think. But I picked the smallest and the most straightforward series to start with, so that would give me sort of an easy win to ease myself into the project and gain momentum. That strategy really worked for me. So in this case, it was the Press Files series. Next slide, please. What is in a congressional collection? The short answer is a lot. This is not an exhaustive list of every single thing that you'll find in every single collection, but in my experience with the Burr papers, these are sort of some of the general categories. So the majority of the collection is the legislative files. That includes everything related to legislation, political issues, and committees. There's press files. This includes news clippings, press releases, and some office notes and strategy, things like that. There's administrative files. This has a wide variety of things. There's campaign files, there's invitation schedules, correspondence, speeches. There's constituent files. This includes letters that were written by constituents. It also includes some of the sort of form responses that the office would send back to constituents. Um, in addition to those things, there's some audiovisual materials, there's interviews, talk shows, campaign advertisements. Um, there's also a photographic archive. And then lastly, there was quite a bit of memorabilia. Um, so some of these objects included gifts from other countries, from delegation trips abroad. There's a large number of plaques, trophies, awards that he won throughout his career. And then there's sort of some personal interesting sports, since he was a football player. There's some football related things, some Wake Forest related things, and then things that are just sort of generally sort of North Carolina interest related. Next slide. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about the memorabilia specifically. This was one of the biggest challenges that we had with this collection. These photos will show you a little bit about it. In total, we received over 1,600 items of memorabilia. Um, some of these items were identified in inventories that were provided by the Burr office when they transferred them to us, but many items were unidentified. Their significance was unclear. This was an appraisal problem for us. Um, we didn't feel like we should keep things that we couldn't identify, didn't know what they were or why they were significant, or even why Burr might have had that item. Um, Additionally to that issue, as an archive, we primarily deal with paper records. We know what to do with paper records, but objects are just more difficult. We're just not experts in, conserving artifacts and storing artifacts. So we had to sort of figure those things out in order to deal with this memorabilia. Um, it took a lot of time. It was quite time and labor intensive, but we were able to appraise every single item in this collection, identify everything that we kept, and find the appropriate housing to preserve each item. And as you can see from the photo, it's quite wide-ranging the number of boxes that we had to order and find and sort of scrounge up to house everything. We were able to figure it out. Um, we had some help from some wonderful student workers who were able to actually take photos of some of the plaques and the trophies so that we could preserve the informational value while disposing of the original. This probably saved us dozens of linear feet in storage space. And from start to finish, dealing with the memorabilia, it took about a year to deal with all of this. So, as I said, it was quite time intensive. And I'm going to talk about the timeline next. Next slide, please. So, this is a screenshot of the processing plan that I had made. So, this was sort of how I thought things might go before I started any processing work. So, this was just sort of my general estimate. Next slide, please. This is what actually happened. So, when I made my original timeline, I sort of, based on the linear feet of each series, tried to make a rough estimate of how long I thought it would take. I tried to add some extra time to each estimate as a buffer. And I didn't think it was necessary at the time, but now I can tell you that buffer time was very important to add. It was necessary. The project would not have stayed on track without adding that buffer time in. So I'm very glad I did that. The original plan was to finish the whole thing in 2 years. Um, I was able to get a third year onto my contract, which was great because we had received an electronic accession in that time. So that was what I worked on with that third year that I had. Next slide, please. You're muted, Stephanie.
Thank you. So we had talked about in the beginning, Kate spoke about sort of the on-ramp. And as a supervisor, I knew I needed to stay out of Kate's way while also trying to be helpful, since I do have experience with large processing projects. So I really tried to be mindful of how to balance sitting on my hands and not backseat driving for her while also making sure that she didn't feel like it was just her versus 500 boxes. So I aimed for a hands-off approach while offering support and structure through regular one-on-ones, since there was a processing plan that, sort of served as a North Star, even understanding that the processing plan was likely to require some flexibility. We also talked about how to and planned out how to communicate externally about our work. Again, since stakeholders included the university president's office, the dean of the library, and potentially even Senator Burr, since we did not know how involved he might want to be in his materials, I wanted to be sure that we were proactive. Kate was great about voicing her opinions, about how often we would meet or what would work for her or not work for her, or what she wanted to try to see if it would work for her, those sorts of things. She asked for what she needed and, made it clear what, her path forward was going to be when there were several options or different approaches possible. There were a few things that came up as Kate continued into the processing work of the collection.
Okay. This journey, like any other, had some hazards along the way. Um, First, there was no opportunity for us to conduct appraisal prior to the transfer of this collection. It would have been beneficial in an ideal world to be able to have conversations with office staff about which records we wanted to keep and which ones we likely wouldn't, especially with the memorabilia, as I talked about. That would have really saved a lot of time if some of that stuff just had not been transferred to us in the first place. Um, Additionally to that, I also discovered pretty early on in this journey, as I was making my box inventory, that there were some major gaps in the records. We only really received paper records through about 2009 to 2010. Um, and then really, we had some memorabilia and a box of paper that covered those years from 2010 to 2023. So this was an issue. Um, that is 12 years of service with his highest years of seniority when he was chairing committees and ranking member of committees. And so we wanted to fill those gaps if we could. Our director was able to reach out to our contact in the Burr office, who was the deputy chief of staff. And through this, he was able to get us an electronic accession. And so we were able to fill this gap with these sort of digital materials. Um, this leads me to the final challenge, which is digital archiving. It's one thing to get a digital accession, that's great, but we actually have to preserve it and provide access and process it and all these things. Um, we at Wake Forest did not have a robust born digital archiving program prior to receiving this accession, and this just was not a good place to start because it was just too huge. I think over 300 gigabytes of sort of poorly organized and difficult to parse material, some of it even dating back to the 90s. Um, so this digital archiving was, even for me as a former digital archivist, it was a tall order.
And then things hit a perhaps bigger pothole. I accepted a job in Wilmington as Kate was just wrapping up the physical processing. Kate and I were both anxious to make sure she had the information and skills that she needed. Uh, but it was difficult to kind of try and figure out what she needed to learn as she was switching from item arrangement and description to collection level work and things in our content management system archive space. So we both did our best to take some time to step back and think about what she needed to know, what she felt like she needed to know, what sort of institutional knowledge I had that I hadn't transferred to her yet. Um, Things that might not occur to Kate to look for or ask about. It felt like there were a lot of those unknown unknowns, but we did our best to shake out all the questions and concerns and go through them. Um, and also try to zoom in on what she needed to do in order to complete the project in a timely manner.
So, as Stephanie mentioned, her departure came at a crucial time in the project. I was sort of wrapping up the physical processing and starting to think about and try to plan for the digital processing. But she told me that she was leaving, and so I just completely stopped my day-to-day work. And as she said, I needed to think about what I would need from her, not just in the next month, but in a year down the line when I'm finishing the whole project. So I needed a couple things. First, I needed her advice on the finding aid, which luckily I had done enough of the processing to be okay, sort of drafting up real quick. So I wrote a draft of the finding aid and I was able to get her comments, was really helpful to get. Next, I needed training on archive space, which was our repository management software. And then lastly, I wanted to review her processing guide that she had written to see if I had any questions on any future part of the process. I really worked hard and was stressing a lot, trying to anticipate every single question I would ever have, basically, for the rest of the project. I learned that this was not possible to do, but I do think that taking some time to try to anticipate the future was really beneficial in this case. So, how did we arrive at our destination? Um, Losing Stephanie was a disruption, but with all our planning, with advanced notice, we were able to anticipate a lot of the future issues, and this was, pretty effective in smoothing the transition. I also had support from our director, who was my supervisor sort of in the interim, while we hired a new collections archivist. In terms of the digital processing, for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about it too much. It could be its own 45-minute presentation or maybe two 45-minute presentations. But all this to say, we were able to work out a plan and execute that plan. I had help from the new collections archivist, and we had a student worker working on this as well. Between the three of us, we were able to get it done. It was over 350 gigabytes of digital materials, and we wrapped that up last fall after about a year of work on this. And the bright side to that as well is that we were able to get a digital workstation up and running at Wake Forest, which is very exciting. Um, we are building our digital archiving program, and this was step one. So that was great to get going. Um, and I have finished the project. It is open. It's ready for research. And in the slides, which you will all have access to after this presentation, I've linked the finding aid. This is the first portion of the finding aid. Next slide. And then this is the digital collection, which is linked as well.
So to wrap up, what went well for us? Communication. I really benefited from Kate's ability to be clear on what she needed and what didn't work for her. I think what I did well was provide opportunities for those conversations and questions, and also to zoom out from processing the collection. The Burr collection consumed her working life to some degree, but it wasn't going to be her whole career. So what else could she be thinking about? What were her next steps after this collection was done? What aspects of the work was she enjoying or not enjoying? Things like that. While the Burr collection was all encompassing, there's plenty out of her that has nothing to do with congressional collections. I also worked to point out that she was doing a great job. She, was managing the schedule, handling complicated processes, working with oddly shaped objects, things like that. And I am grateful that ZSR had things in place to help smooth the path. Things like, as she said, the mentor, there was a processing manual. We had archival supplies that we could pretty easily stock when she needed something unusual. And there were also professional development funds and related resources. So, the groups that she spoke about, the Society of North Carolina Archivists, things like that, plus national groups. So plenty of training and workshops that she could attend on a variety of topics that she could go to thanks to professional development funding through the university. What aspects are a little bit bumpier? Kate, tell us.
I will. So Stephanie and I were both sort of shifting into new roles and responsibilities. I was coming from the public sector into this new position. Stephanie was taking on management duties of a full-time faculty member for the first time. This may not come as a shock to many of you, but it's worth mentioning that large collections are hard. They require a lot of time, attention, and organization, just on a whole other level from collections that are smaller. That is why having a project archivist for something like this was crucial, and this would not have happened without me doing this 100% of the time. Lastly, congressional collections specifically have their own quirks, issues with classified information being found. That was in the news around the time that I started this, so that was top of mind as I was processing this collection. Personally identifiable information could be found throughout, and especially with the constituent letters. And then have I mentioned the memorabilia? The memorabilia was really tough. And so those are just a few of the challenges that we were able to overcome in successfully processing this collection.
And thank you for your time listening to our presentation. We're happy to take questions. Or if you think of something later, we're available via email.